So good morning, everybody. Welcome to our fantastic pavilion. And I just want to say up front a big thank you to our UK pavilion sponsors. It really is a great space, and particularly thanks to Corporate Leaders Group and SSE who are on our panel today. So thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this really significant event hosted by the Exeter University Economics of Energy Innovation and System Transitions Project. That is a real mouthful. So actually, that's why it's great we can call it the EAST Project for shorthand. And that's going to be, we're presenting today and chaired today by Simon Sharp of S-Curve Economics. So it's great to be joining this group of world-leading academics and policy practitioners. So really looking forward to the discussion. So we are going to be discussing and exploring the transformative potential new economic models can have on energy innovation and transition policy making, helping governments to cut carbon emissions faster and more affordably. This is what the EAST project aims to do. It's basically about assisting governments of large emerging economies to reduce emissions more swiftly by revolutionising the economic analysis that informs their decisions. And the work that's done by EAST in synthesising key information available for policymakers and in testing them and deploying models, updating those and making them relevant is really invaluable. So the EAST project, I think, is now in its 5th year. Which is fantastic, and it's already achieved remarkable milestones. So phase 1 EAST project's flagship report, launched at COP26, found that policies central to the most outstanding successes in low carbon transitions so far in Europe, China, India and Brazil were generally adopted despite, not because of, predominant economic analysis and advice. The project has produced 3 comprehensive reports that provide strong evidence on the need for new economic approaches, covering decision-making frameworks, principles of policy-making and modelling. And additionally, the project has established communities of practice in China, India and Brazil, and has engaged with policymakers to apply new economic thinking to climate change. Looking ahead, the EAST project has ambitious goals and plans as it continues to develop the future technology transformations model and its application to inform policy choices on the deployment of clean technologies in hydrogen, fertilisers, steel and heavy road transport in high-emitting emerging economies. And by co-developing partnerships between local and international experts, EAST research modelling and policy advice can really help support real-world policy making and accelerate clean energy transitions at a global level. My voice is a bit croaky. Do you think I could you give me a bit of water? Sorry, excuse me. And given EAST's success to date, its huge onward potential, I'm absolutely thrilled that we in the UK government were able to fund this work alongside the Children's Investment Fund Foundation through the UK's International Climate Finance. The EAST project is a prime example of how UK's ICF programmes are making a tangible impact by providing the necessary financial support, but also, as in the case of EAST, equipping developing countries with the technical expertise and tools they need to undertake transitions that can help them to prevent and tackle the challenges caused by climate change, biodiversity loss and environmental degradation, as well as maximise the wider opportunities these transitions can bring about. One particularly valuable concept our speakers will focus on in today's event is that of creating positive tipping cascades. And this is when policies and investments create a domino effect across different sectors to create a self-reinforcing cycle of positive change. In this case, accelerating the transition to low-carbon economy. We see policy interventions can drive significant shifts, enabling market dynamics to take over. To this effect, we very much hope the UK's coal phase-out serves as a significant global tipping cascade. In just 10 years, the UK will have reduced coal accounting for almost a third of our electricity supply to zero. In September, we closed our last coal-fired power station. We are officially coal-free in the UK. And this sends a really strong signal globally for other governments to accelerate the global transition from coal to clean energy. We must phase out unabated coal use by 2040 and much sooner for developing economies. For developed economies. We hope this sets a powerful example for other countries to follow in reducing their reliance on coal and cutting greenhouse gas emissions. As we look forward to COP30, it's crucial that we scale up ambition and action to keep 1.5 Paris goal within reach and bridge the emissions gap, which is significant. The UK has set its own 1.5 nationally determined contribution here at COP. Prime Minister Starmer did that earlier in the week, and will support others to do similar in terms of really focusing on pushing the ambition through these NDCs. Globally, we need to accelerate the transition in energy and other sectors, and the UK will show progress through initiatives such as the Breakthrough Agenda and the Global Clean Power Alliance. This progressive alliance of developed and developing countries works together to accelerate the deployment of clean power globally and mobilise public and private finance to support clean energy. Lastly, I would like to just mention the Breakthrough Agenda again. It recently launched its third annual report assessing international collaboration in 6 major emitting sectors: power, hydrogen, road transport, steel, cement and buildings. The kind of analysis East is providing can help governments identify how to cross tipping points and where clean technologies outcompete fossil fuels in their own countries, and can also help countries understand how to best work together to cross those tipping points more quickly in the global economy. This is the essence of the Breakthrough Agenda, and it is through collaborative efforts like the East Project that we can achieve these ambitious goals. So thank you all for being here today. I'm really looking forward to hearing the insights and perspectives from our fantastic speakers as they delve into the opportunities to accelerate transitions to net zero in transport, power, hydrogen and hard-to-abate sectors in the critical decade. Simon, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Good morning, all. For those here with us in person, thank you for joining us first thing in the morning to talk about tipping points, and welcome to help yourself to croissants and whatever else is over there as well. We're also being joined by people online. We can't see you, but hopefully you can see us, hopefully you can hear us, and you're very welcome too. So, why are we talking about tipping points? Well, the context is a few years ago when the IPCC did its special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, then it said that we need to roughly halve global emissions during this decade. And we're now nearly halfway through this decade, and global emissions are still more or less going up or flat. They haven't started going down yet. So we're now looking at a situation where, in principle, we're supposed to be halving global emissions in about 6 years, which sounds insanely difficult. So it's useful to think about how can we speed up progress and where are the opportunities for disproportionate gain from policies? Where can we have a relatively small push and a very big outcome? And that's what tipping points are, by definition. So get to where the slides actually start. There we go. So if you think about it, in every transition, there has to be a tipping point, because you start off with one set of technologies and all the business practices and infrastructure and everything around them, and you end up with a completely different set. So somewhere in the middle, there has to be a point where consumers decide that they prefer the new technology, investors decide that they prefer it, businesses decide to make it because it's more profitable. That has to be there somewhere. In fact, there may be more than one tipping point along the way in any given transition. So if they're out there, then we can find them, we can activate them. And I put this up, I know it's a bit of a complex slide, but it's showing the process of a transition as represented by Frank Heels, who's one of the top authors for the IPCC on this subject, system transitions. And it shows each one has different stages. In the early stage, the emergence stage, it's where you're discovering the new technologies, figuring out what can work, and eventually settling on a dominant design that then spreads. The fusion stage is where it spreads through the markets, it spreads through society, and the old and new technologies are doing battle with each other. And then you get to the reconfiguration stage where the new technology is becoming dominant, but there are still many systems to reorganize and reconfigure around it. Infrastructure systems, markets, social systems, and so on. And so which policies are most effective for accelerating towards and past tipping points are different at each of those stages of the transition. And I'll give very brief examples of sectors that are at, each one is in a different stage of the transition. Just before I do that, to say a couple of examples where we can identify tipping points having been crossed. Both of them correspond to the world's fastest transitions in those sectors. In the power sector, the UK was doing what a lot of other countries have done, subsidizing solar and wind and other renewables, growing those, having a price on carbon, and so on. But we had one thing that was unusual within that context. When the fossil fuels were fighting over a shrinking share of the market, thanks to the growth of renewables, a fixed tax just happened to make coal more expensive than gas instead of the other way around. That crossed a tipping point that led to an incredibly fast reduction of coal in the system, from about 40% in 2012 to absolutely zero now. As Lee said, the last coal power station has been closed down about a month ago. That tipping point had a huge effect. And the UK's power sector decarbonisation over the last decade has been about 8 times faster than the global average. The other example shown here is Norway. This slide was from a few years ago, 2019, I think. But at that stage, Norway was the only country in the world that had used subsidy and tax in combination to make electric vehicles cheaper at the point of purchase than petrol cars. And its EV share of car sales was then about 20 times higher than the global average. So that's the disproportionate cause and effect, incredibly useful when it happens. I'm going in reverse order of the stages of transition so that it leads on to what we're going to discuss some more. So first, the power sector is the furthest one along. In the advanced economies, it's really getting into the reconfiguration stage. It's already crossed the first tipping point where solar and wind become cheaper than coal and gas. It's now approaching a second tipping point where solar plus storage becomes cheaper than coal and gas. And these simulation model projections are showing by 2030, solar and storage could be half the price of coal power in some of these major economies. So the policies that really matter here in the reconfiguration stage, they're not so much about relative price anymore. They're much more about reconfiguring the system. They're things to do with investing in grid infrastructure, long duration energy storage, bringing down the cost of capital in developing countries. Second to mention road transport. Road transport has also, in the advanced markets, crossed the first tipping point where, on a life cycle basis, electric vehicles are cheaper than petrol cars or diesel cars. It's now approaching the second tipping point where they're also cheaper at the point of purchase. And in fact, in China, this has already happened for the relatively low-cost end of the market. So China's really accelerating ahead of the rest of us. But it's not far off for the other big economies. It's coming up within a year or two. Here, in this sector, at this stage of the transition, it's the regulatory policies that are most powerful. The clean technology mandates, particularly the zero-emission vehicle mandates, can force investment from the old to the new and push it down the cost curve even more quickly than it already is going. Get us to that cost parity tipping point, the second tipping point, several years earlier. Finally, the sector we're going to talk about a bit more on the panel, steel. Like all of the energy-intensive industries, steel is really at the beginning. It's in the emergent stage of the transition. We've got some idea of the technologies likely to be important, but they've not really yet begun diffusing through the sector. So we need to think about how to get it started. And one tipping point we can think about is in industry confidence. It's a big bet, a big risky bet to invest in your first near zero emission steel plant. It might cost you $2 billion and the output is going to be more expensive than the steel currently on the market. So what does it take for you to decide as a steel firm you can make that investment instead of not making that investment, doing clean steel instead of blast furnaces? I hope we're going to have some discussion of that. I'm showing a few model results, but I think Subrata will talk a bit more about that, so maybe I won't preview it too much. But But apart from that first tipping point, we can also think about a second one in global markets. How do we get to the point where clean steel is out-competing fossil fuel steel in global markets? That's a question of cost, but it's also a question of expectations. Now, all of these markets are connected, but much of that trade is regional, within North America, within Asia, within Europe. So it's not so easy as we just stick some CBAMs in Europe and expect the whole of the rest of the world to follow us. Or maybe people think it is. We can discuss. So a final word before we come to the panel is that these different sectors, each one has to go through its own system transition, but they're also connected by these reinforcing feedbacks of deployment and cost reduction, the shared technologies. This is a report, you'll find it on some of the seats around here, that is looking at this potential for crossing the tipping point in one sector to get us closer in other sectors. And you see when you have really strong policies in one sector, as well as getting you closer towards the tipping point in that sector, it helps you bring forward the tipping point in the other sectors. Two particularly good examples that in this report we called super leverage points for the transition. One is zero-emission vehicle mandates, because they really force a lot of investment into batteries, bring down the cost of batteries. That helps you in the power sector transition, which helps you in everything else through electrification. The other is coal phase-out. Coal phase-out regulatory policies in the power sector help accelerate the shift to clean power, make that cheaper, and that helps you get towards the tipping points where you're using clean electricity for things like heat pumps, electric vehicles, electric trucks, and so on. Of course, there are many, many dimensions at play there, and many different ways that can be sped up. Even in this modeling, we're really underrepresenting the helpful linkages that there are between different sectors. So that's as much as I want to say. There are plenty, all of the reports from the East Project are online. You can find them all on there. Now I'm going to sit back down and come to our panel. I think we're going to pass this along. It looks like we've just got one mic. So, no, are there others down there? Oh, okay, really, really good. So, Rana, we're going to come to you first. I think many people probably know Rana, but just in case you don't, Rana's the chief of the Division of Energy and Climate Action at UNIDO, and leading some really important international work on industrial decarbonization. And Rana, some of that work is focused on public procurement for steel, also cement. Would you like to tell us about why? Why public procurement? Why is that important at this stage of the transition? And why is it even better if countries do that together instead of just individually?
Sure. Thank you, Simon. Do you hear me? Okay. Interesting. Yeah, the acoustics here are quite good. Thanks. Yeah. So yeah, thanks a lot for this inspiring work, and thanks a lot to the UK for the great partnership. I mean, I wouldn't say we're co-leading this a lot with your support. So thank you so much for the trust in UNIDO. So why are we focusing on green procurement? In the case of steel, cement and concrete, there's a need for some major investments to be really transitioning and getting towards near zero. Well, even the low carbon transition is going to need quite a lot of funding. And industries need to see some certainty in terms of the appetite of the market to take in their product. At the moment, the market doesn't really distinguish whether a product is low carbon or not, a carbon is near zero carbon or not. If I am buying steel for a construction project, the procurement specification doesn't really provide for the low carbon value. And so this we have identified as a challenge, but also an opportunity. The challenge is to actually agree and harmonize the definitions of what low carbon products are and what near zero products are. And also with this emergence of multiple standards that are either used by industry or different regions, how do we compare these across different regions and companies in order to get to something that is comparable? because these two elements are essential for procurement as well. So why procurement? Because it does give the market that certainty. It does give the investor in the technologies the clear signal that there is a market for your product, and so encourages them to make that investment. And I was just actually in September discussing with SSAB Steel. You must all know, they're one of the pioneers in this, and they've piloted one of the first pilots for green hydrogen. But now they really see that because of offtake agreements that they have secured in the private sector, because of companies like Volvo and others that are really making also procurement commitments to buy the low carbon or near zero, in that case, steel, then they have really decided to go forward for the full investment and implement a full project and not only the pilot. So this is a good indicator, but we need a lot more than just private procurement. And public procurement is powerful because government procures quite a lot of steel, cement and concrete for public construction projects. We need it for rail, we need it for the road infrastructure, we need it for housing. Obviously, different countries at different development stage, the proportion of these is going to be different. Maybe it's road and railway in the UK, but it's actually buildings and infrastructure in Egypt. So basically, we've done a study and an assessment of how much is procurement accounting for in terms of public construction, and it's around 25 to 40% on average. And I'll tell you in a bit what is the UK's proportion on that, because we've just done an assessment of that as well. And so it is a very powerful lever to create that push, and that's why under the so-called Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative and the Green Public Procurement Pledge, what we have pledged to do ourselves is to work with a number of countries to advance on the topics of definitions and standards, reporting against that, but most importantly, to create an ambition among these countries to procure low carbon and near zero steel, cement and concrete for public construction projects. So there's a pledge, and the first level of that pledge is actually for countries to require disclosure of embodied carbon on public construction projects, because we need to know where do we stand. And then the second level is for governments to commit towards procurement of near zero carbon cement by 2030. And then the third level is to 2050 and so on. So we have now 4 governments that are fully committed to the 3 levels of the pledge, and these are the UK, Canada, Germany, as well as the US. And we also have some countries that have pledged to undertake consultations because within their jurisdiction to come back to us with some commitments, and these are the governments of Japan, Austria, as well as the UAE. Now, with that commitment that the UK made, for example, so what we see is that for the cement, it's about 24% of the UK consumption of cement is used in for the public sector. So public sector construction, 24% of the cement in the UK, and around 9% of the steel consumption. So since the UK has committed to this level 3 of the pledge, that could help actually in bringing down the emission to 83% only, and by 2050, and we need to be at 93% by 2050. So there's certainly here is the scope for the near zero. So it's not only the low carbon, but the tipping points you're talking about. We really need to go towards the near zero, and that's where we would encourage countries also to look at the level 4 of the pledge, which is a commitment to procure near zero steel, cement, and concrete for signature projects. Why is it important for countries to come together on this? And why is it, we have really leading countries that have committed to the pledge. I think this is to create a broader market, because these are globally traded commodities. You've alluded to that. And also we have half of the world's consumption in China. And so it's great that we have a certain coalition that's moving in one direction, and hopefully it helps move others as well to that direction. So thanks a lot. I'll stop here. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you, Rana. And I think the IDDI is an incredibly important initiative. So I just really encourage anybody here in the audience to help build support for that, to bring more countries into it and to get those commitments up to level 4. Because if we do that, I think that could be really powerful in helping the transition get started. So next I'm going to come to Subrata Chakrabarti, Associate Program Director of the Climate Program in the World Resources Institute, India. And Subrata, I know India is a member of the Industry Deep Decarbonization Initiative. It's also a member of the Leadership Group for Industry Transition. Like most countries up until now, it's industry policies. To the extent that they've been focused on the transition, it's been more about energy efficiency than the deployment of the new technologies. But maybe that's beginning to change, and there are policy options under consideration. And in WRI India, you're beginning to use some simulation modeling to help test different policies and show how they might come out. So please tell us a bit about that work. I know you have a few slides, so if I can pass you the... Go for it. That one goes forward.
Thank you, Simon. I hope everybody can hear me better. Okay, because, yeah. All right, let me just quickly pass on to the work, but thank you so much, Simon, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure. I guess we were in panel last time in Sharm. Hopefully, we can do it more often than COP. Yeah. So I would like to focus on why we are talking about steel. Really, if you look at the slide, that's basically a pie which shows that steel comprises of almost 37% of the entire industrial emissions, and we do have a national steel policy that sort of targets to reach somewhere close to 300 million tons of steel production from existing 120 mil. And that is being fueled by rapid urbanization and construction, right? And so steel decarbonization, if you see, and mostly that's the picture of the world, but mostly in India, what happens is that we are talking about steel making in two processes. One is iron making and another one is steel making. Now, the modeling work that we are doing, the energy economy modeling work, it basically combines this steel making with the clear transitional production options that you can see in the slide. And I'll talk more about it. And it basically requires two things. One is effective policy options, and it also needs to take into account what really investors want. What are investors' preferences, right? So there are two questions essentially. What could be those policies that can be enacted, and how can we shift the preferences of investors? What we are doing it's called Future Technology Transformation Model, and we have sort of clubbed it with E3ME. And we have, whenever we talk about energy economy modeling, it's mostly the two options that we talk about. One is optimization and one is simulation, right? So in case of optimization, what happens is that you set a goal and then you optimize the policies. But in case of simulation, it basically gives a real-world flavor because the policies and the changes and the technological changes that will come are pretty uncertain. So FTT model actually helps you apply different policy options to sort of understand what could be the different pathways for the low-carbon steel production, right? So what we have done is we have considered a few policy options. As you can see in the slides, these are 5 policy options that we have considered for 7 major steel producers, which roughly comprises of 80% of the steel production globally. And what we do is we sort of evaluate the effectiveness of these policies in decarbonizing the steel production, and study the tipping point, like you mentioned during your opening remarks. This is still work in progress, but what I thought that I'll show you is this result is an example from China, and you can see the different policy leads to different options. In reference scenario, we are basically talking about the conventional, conventional process of steel making. But if we combine different policies, new pathways really emerges, right? Subsidies do have right now a very little part to play, but bottom line is that we need to really think about combining different policies in order to reach the kind of deep decarbonization that we are aiming for. So that's my slide, and I can talk more about what we are really doing in India from the policy perspective, what government is doing, but maybe after this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Subrata. Next, we're going to go from a policy perspective to an industry perspective. And we have Beverly Cornaby, Director of Policy and Systems Change Collaborations at the UK Corporate Leaders Group, who are one of our UK Pavilion sponsors. Thank you very much. And Beverly, I wonder if you can tell us, from industry's point of view, they see government thinking about these policy options. They see people like us doing modeling studies and talking about it. But for them, it's, as we said earlier, incredibly high risk and a matter of survival, maybe, how this transition is navigated. So what are the industry players from steel and other energy-intensive industries, what are they saying about the policies that are most needed?
Thank you. In terms of the policies that are most needed, really what we're looking at is, overall is actually words that keep being said, which is around certainty, it's around clarity, it's around consistency. In respect to that, in the UK, we haven't had an industrial strategy for a number of years. There is currently a consultation out actually to create a new industrial strategy, and that will hopefully bring that clarity and certainty. It's set to be a 10-year strategy, and therefore actually will cover that long term, not just the short term in terms of what needs to happen. And this is one of the things that where you've got sectors like steel, that we really need to be setting out what is the pathway. Now, one of the things that I want to pick up, which both my colleagues here have said, is actually around demand-led innovation. So a lot of policies at the moment are actually more on the supply side in terms of actually how do we enable it. So some of the ones that you mentioned earlier, Simon, they are about, how do we make sure that the sector is decarbonising? What we also need to do, which procurement and innovation come into this, is actually create demand-led policies. And actually, how do we enable, therefore, the demand to increase to mean that actually that transition is enabled? And we've been doing some work around that. And so some of it is actually creating the demand for the low carbon products and materials. Some of it is actually around how to encourage that innovation, but the scaling of that innovation and actually enabling that innovation to take place. Part of it is also around international collaboration, and certainly we're at the COP here, and that is where there is an ideal opportunity to actually look how do we go beyond borders in terms of actually creating that demand for low carbon materials. We do know, we've heard there about some of the initiatives that are being led from a country level and a government level, but also there are business-led initiatives as well. In the UK, we have Steel Zero, and so that is actually businesses themselves who are committing to actually, reducing the amount of steel, or high carbon steel, should we say, that they're actually procuring. So they have targets to buy or specify net zero steel by 2050, with an interim commitment of using 50% responsibly produced steel by 2030. And this is important because if those strong demand signals aren't sent, then the industry is not actually going to be able to want to make that investment. And if we don't get that investment, then actually we're not going to transition at the speed we know. Some of those policies that are needed as well are around electrification, and certainly within the UK, we are looking, one of the missions of the current government is around clean power. And so therefore electrification and actually how we enable that clean power, and that may also be looking at other sources as well and other options for actually how we enable that clean power transition. But we need to do it quite quickly, and certainly the government have a target of enabling clean power by 2030, which is quite a short period of time. And there's not challenge, there is challenges within that. It's not without challenge, But at the same time, we do have a lot of the technologies and a lot of the actual the kind of what we need, the actual bedrock, so to speak, to actually enable that to go forward. But what we need to speed up is that implementation. And that's really going to be our challenge over the next few years, is how do we support industry through actually the clean power transition, therefore that they know that they can actually invest as well to support that. There's kind of more specifics that I could probably go into, but for now I'll hand over. Thank you.
Beverly, thank you. That was really clear and wonderfully concise. We're going to move to another industry perspective, but a slightly different one. We're lucky to have Sam Peacock with us, Managing Director of Corporate Affairs, Regulation and Strategy at SSE, which is also one of our UK Pavilion sponsors. Thank you very much. And also, even more importantly, a big investor in offshore wind in the UK, which is one of our real success stories, as anyone who comes to this pavilion is doubtless going to know, because we find it hard not to talk about it. Sam, I wonder if you can tell us a bit from the experience in your industry. How is it that policy did lead to such dramatic cost reduction? I think it was about 70% over the course of a decade. And is there anything in that we should really learn lessons from and apply as we attempt the decarbonisation of steel?
Thanks, Simon. To be honest, I hadn't seen the work on this until about 51 minutes ago, and I think it's really, really good. I think it's really high quality work, so I echo Lee's point at the beginning, I think, actually. I mean, now we do look back on that offshore wind storyline very, very positively for fairly obvious reasons, but it wasn't always like that. I remember a time a while back, I remember when our outgoing CEO took over actually about 11 years ago, and I remember the first question he was asking me and the team was, is the UK government serious about offshore wind? Because at that point the price was very, very high, and things like Dogger Bank, we're building Dogger Bank, the world's largest offshore wind farm, that was almost a sort of glimmer in the distance. It really didn't seem like a feasible thing that we'd actually do. But to be honest, a lot of government perseverance and probably a fantastic industry collaboration is what's led to the success story we see today. You would never have thought we were putting sort of the Eiffel Tower and then attaching the London Eye into the middle of the North Sea, and that's literally what people are doing right now, which is just absolutely fantastic. How did that story happen, which I guess is the interesting point? How did we get there? I think a few things. I think that governments almost set industry this target of how can you get beneath £100 a megawatt hour. That seemed to be the kind of number out there that we ought to strive towards, and that was quite a good line. It had something that you could sit there and aim for. But then they also developed the subsidy mechanism in a very clever way as you went through that journey. Like at the beginning, it was a subsidy. There was quite a big top up on the electricity price, quite a big set of government targets, and you could get out there, start to put some wind turbines out there, start to challenge the supply chain, start to get it down. But it was necessarily generous at that point because the risks were unbelievably high, and you were sitting there looking at it and thinking this is a very, very risky investment. But then as we started to do it, as the rest of the supply chain started to get more comfortable, the bankers started to get more comfortable, the insurance people started to get more comfortable, government realised, wait a minute, we need to slightly move this to a different sort of support mechanism. And the one they then put in, the CFD, is really interesting, I think, because it isn't a subsidy in that way. It's a revenue stabilisation. So it allows us to get debt into projects. It allows us to start to keep the investment pace very high, reduce some risk, but actually we've seen that it actually gives money back to consumers. So you saw parts of the energy crisis where, actually we're very, very thankful to have that revenue stabilisation mechanism in there because it was really helping customers. So I suppose, just thinking back on your work, finally, I think there was a decent carbon price in the market, but it would not have been anywhere near enough to drive that activity then. And probably even if it had been cranked up to some very, very high number, I still don't think it would have driven it because it would have just not had that sort of stability out there and that ability to focus on something that was clearly there and clearly protecting revenue. So I'll probably leave it at that. But probably the last thing I would say actually is industry took some risks as well. I remember when we were building Greater Gabbard, if you look at the cost of this big offshore wind farm off the East Anglia, when you're putting that in, it was some really big percentage of our actual market cap at that point. So industry was also prepared to take quite a bunch of risks out there. So I think it's a really, really interesting story. And the last thing, when you think about that green steel angle, I was sitting there thinking, how can offshore wind help deploy it? And we'd love to be deploying it, and we'd like to work towards deploying it, but I would be very wary of sticking all of the cost on the electricity customer, because they're having to pay quite a bit for energy right now. So I think we would like to be a user of it, but we wouldn't want to be the full guinea pig, so that you end up sort of putting all of that on our technology, because I think you then start to hold it back a bit, maybe compared to some other things. So I'll probably leave it at that, Simon, but thought your work was brilliant.
Thanks, Sam. Those wonderful comments. It's so nice to hear such a frank description of that experience. And you mentioned the government setting that target of £100 a megawatt hour. I was in government at that time working for the energy minister, and I remember just how uncertain it was. Really, nobody knew if anybody could hit that target. But as it happened, it was only a couple of years later that the strike price, the winning bids in the auction, came in at £57.50 per megawatt hour. Unbelievably low, far below anybody's expectations. So it's nice the way you put it, that government was taking risks, political risks, to do that, and industry was taking risks as well. But there was well-designed policy and really strong innovation in industry, and they aligned in the right kind of way. Now, for a final comment, we're going to go to Professor Michael Grubb, Professor of Energy and Climate Change at University College London. And for anyone who doesn't know him, Michael's really one of the leading thinkers on the economics of the low-carbon transition. And Michael, I know you've studied what happened in offshore wind very much, and also you're thinking about the linkages between the transitions in power and industry. So I really, rather than asking a particular question, I'd like to just give you the chance to reflect on what you've heard from the different panelists and offer your thoughts on how do we get towards the tipping points in the steel transition.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon and all. Yeah, it actually turns out to be a great combination here in terms of that story, because we've had the industry talking about the risks that they took. Simon was in the government and I was in the energy regulator, all at that critical period. And I remember looking and the discussion and the energy regulator saying, my God, this offshore wind stuff is really expensive. I mean, we know the regulator's supposed to be facilitating government policy, but it's also trying to protect consumers. And is this really going to be justified? And so there were quite strong concerns about, the implications. And as you say, I think nobody in the entire system in the UK believed that the cost of offshore wind could drop so far, so fast. I think it astonished us all. With hindsight, we can see the combinations. Industry had more confidence, they took some risks, they also put capital into R&D, they're learning, the economies of scale, increased confidence, financial sector, all of those things lined up, all were necessary to bring down the cost. We need to achieve the same thing for green steel. I've been involved in energy innovation transition research for quite a few years now, including helping to co-lead the first phase of the East programme. So I came to this meeting slightly wondering, is there really anything new to say? And the answer is, yeah, actually, it's interesting. Some of our understanding keeps unearthing new insights. Two I would pick up from the work and the report that I was just flicking through, which is great. Congratulations, Simon, the Exeter team, and all. We've also got the synthesis report from the first round of East, just the executive summary. That covers a lot of the other stuff. But the two things that really struck me now is the interaction of policies and investment as the critical interface. So it's not just, is there a clever subsidy structure that gives more confidence? That was great. It's certainly not just, does this require more government throwing money thrown? But it is what kind of instrument, at what kind of time will unleash the kind of switch of investment that you need. And that, I think, is the crucial thing in your report about mandates in the vehicle sector in particular. It's kind of right. There's huge amount of money still going into fossil fuel cars at a time when we know we can do electric vehicles just as cheaply. So the obvious powerful mechanism is to force that switch faster. Obviously, you can't do that prematurely in sectors where there's not that capacity to switch rapidly. But I think that question of which instruments force a more rapid switch of investment in the major pools of capital. I think the other thing is we're now clearly entering a phase of intersectoral innovation. strategies and interactions on supply and demand, but I'll just flag one obvious one. I had an exchange with Chris Bataille, who's one of the world's leaders on steel, because I'm not a steel technology geek. And he said, well, we've identified at least 7 different technological paths towards low carbon or zero carbon steel. Nearly all of them rely on electricity at one stage or another. This is going to be an electrification game. And the most important single determining factor for the competitiveness of green steel in the long run is what kind of electricity and at what kind of cost. But bear in mind, this will be ramping up at precisely the time when we have a lot of the existing renewables coming off their government support contracts, wondering how valuable will their electricity be when they're just facing the wholesale market volatility. So I think some discussions about can we organise more direct and economically efficient ways that give steel industry confidence about the cost of electricity. And I say confidence, it is not, obviously the level matters, but the confidence matters. And can we give those who have invested and taken big risks now facing actually a lot of uncertainty about what's my electricity going to be worth when I'm generating stuff that's got no support contract and where we're starting to see the electricity price crash to zero in the wholesale market some of the time and then suddenly leap up. So I think that intersection is going to be a really interesting new frontier, and I think your report touches on it for the first time in depth. That's great.
Thank you, Michael.
Can I add one other remark? One thing I've observed is the human brain is not well adapted to understand exponential change. And I think that's one of the things that there's going to be a lot of surprises, even into 5-year timescale. Just take your spreadsheets and try it. It's amazing what could change in the next 5 to 10 years.
If you put exponential change in a spreadsheet, you'll probably break the spreadsheet, but you can try. So thanks to everybody for actually being very, very snappy, which was wonderful for this time in the morning. That does give us a chance to go for some discussion. I'm hoping that some of you here will have some questions that have been provoked by our panelists. If you do, please stick up a hand, and I think there's a roving mic. Great, there's one over there. Let's lend a mic. Here we go.
I'm grateful for the intervention by WRI, which said that we need policy mixes. We need several instruments that act together. There's also very important work by Michael Grubb showing that we have several market failures. We need several instruments. I think that is always very important to keep in mind. I just looked at the report and it was comparing regulations and carbon pricing and then making a comparison between these two. I think that is extremely misleading. Carbon pricing is a completely different instrument to all other policies because it is the only instrument that implements the polluter pays principle. It doesn't fundamentally try to reduce carbon emissions. That is not the primary objective of carbon pricing. The primary objective of carbon pricing is to internalize the cost of pollution and to implement the polluter pays principle. It isn't meant to be driving the transition. It is meant to internalize costs. And that means that it is not carbon pricing or forcing the transition through regulations. We need these two acting together, and I thought that came out very well from the WI, and I was a bit sad about that in the East report. So I think it's important we need that transition together.
Thank you, Dirk. I wonder if, Michael, you'd like to comment briefly on that. I think there's a couple of points there. One is, what's the purpose of carbon pricing? And the other is obviously about policy combinations, or is it legit? I think we all agree that policies in combination are what's needed. But despite that, is it legitimate and useful to compare the effectiveness of different policies?
I think that depends on being very clear about what comparison you're drawing and why and at what stage. Strategically, I very much agree with Dirk. And two remarks. One a mini tail, which is, I think it's well accepted that the carbon price in the UK was incredibly important driving the shift from coal to gas, no question. And there's been a general sense maybe emerging that, well, it's quite good at marginal substitution when that sort, but it's not a main driver of investment. And I think that's kind of true, but as one of the people on the Swedish steel project said to me, The really interesting thing is the reason we could do it was because of government subsidies, including set-aside. The reason we wanted to do it was because of the existence of the European emissions trading system, which made us think, well, we don't know exactly how quickly or how far this is going to succeed technologically, cost reductions, but we have confidence there'll be a market for green steel in the 2030s because of there will be a carbon price in Europe. So strategically, the board wanted to do this project, and otherwise probably wouldn't, even though the money was there from government, so it's a distraction from our main business. But this was a strategic play. And I think the other remark from an IPCC co-author, he said, I don't understand this comparative about is carbon pricing better or worse or whatever. He said, it's an instrument, and basically if you don't have the prices in your economy aligned with your objective, then everything else is just going to be harder. So why can't we just say that and then get on with all of the other things we need to do as well? So I think that's what you're saying. Let's kind of move on to really embodying this point that we need all the things, they play different roles and maybe different roles over different time scales. But yeah, if you don't have a trajectory of carbon pricing, it's going to make everything else harder.
Thank you, Michael. I saw a hand. There's a hand over here. First, it's Mads from the Danish Finance.
Hi, everyone.
Ministry.
Hi, Simon. Thanks for this great presentation. Mads Liberin from the Danish Ministry of Finance. I want to be short on my question here because we're talking sort of carbon pricing and or regulation standards and so on. But one thing is you could say, when we do industrial strategy, are we sure that you could say the technologies we pick are the ones that's actually going to work? How do we make sure that we're actually sort of not betting the wind farm on a technology that won't really scale and deliver? That's something we're struggling with massively now, is that ministries of finance don't really have tools to address and assess sort of what is the right path. So what's the latest out there in terms of actually not just sort of going for industrial strategy, but also sort of realizing when are you going down the wrong path? How do you course correct? How do you do that faster?
Thanks, Mads. Beverly, I thought I'd put that question to you because you mentioned the need for clarity and certainty and UK industrial strategy. How do we make sure we're not applying that clarity and certainty to the wrong thing?
That is a very good question, I think, and it's one that in terms of looking at policies and looking at, we've got to make sure that we're looking at actually the long-term benefits and the long-term in terms of the cost, which comes back, so I'm just going to read those. Because actually, when you look at it, if you're going to invest in something, you want to know it's there for the long term. And I think this is actually the de-risking point as well that you mentioned about, because actually, we didn't know actually that wind farms would really pick off in the way it did and that the price would therefore lower. And I think therefore it's looking at what is going to be investable for the long term. I'm just trying to think whether there's any specific examples that I can bring on that, but I think it is one that we've got to work with between industry and government to actually look at what the different pathways are. And it might be country specific as well. So if we look at the UK, in terms of our power, we're very much going down a renewables route, but it may be others that go down green hydrogen or other areas. And I think it's got to look at the geography and actually what is most applicable to that geography. I think there's also a bit there of looking at across geographies as well in terms of, we need to look at actually, for the UK, we'll look at where are we most competitive and therefore what makes actually sense in terms of actually which industries we develop and which we actually really put into. So yeah, I hope that partly answers the question, but I have to say I think this is also where the modelling comes in, because without the modelling, actually it's very difficult to see which are the best pathways or which of them actually can lead to the best outcomes in terms of the cost, in terms of actually the deliverables to actually reduce emissions as well, and therefore what are the combinations that we need.
Thanks, Beverly. There's a hand at the back there.
Great, thanks. Tom McHenry from Pomona College in California. Interested, very thoughtful comments about innovation and pricing. I know you may have discussed this before because I came in later, but what do you think of the carbon border adjustment mechanism? Is that a model? And are we going to see it grow and its status?
Thank you. Subrata, why don't I put that to you? Because India is one of the countries that is looking at this going, oh, hey, thanks, Europe. There's a carbon border adjustment. What do we do about that? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? If it's a bad thing, what should we be doing instead?
Thank you, Simon, for the question. As far as CVM is concerned, the feeling in the industry is quite mixed up, but it has more to do with respect to penalizing the industry which are there in India, and they're sort of thinking about expanding in other areas, right? But I believe there are a few nuances that need to be taken into consideration. The EU delegation was there probably in August or September, talking to the industry, talking to the Ministry of Finance and all. They're sort of figuring it out. But my perspective, with reference to decarbonizing the industry, if I can take that route, we are yet to sort of define the framework for green steel, since we are talking about the steel, number one. Number two, the supply chain is yet to come in terms to carbon border adjustment mechanism as to how it is going to impact. So there are a lot of unanswered questions which are still there. There are few answers that we know. There are few answers that are still we're still trying to figure out. For example, how the data is going to be used, whether we are going to only use the direct emissions data or we are also going to consider the indirect emissions, right? One more thing that I thought I'll just put on, when we talk about the pricing, there are two type of policies that really work sort of in India. One is what I call it as carrot policy, one is stick policy, right? When we talk about the decarbonization, there are a lot of industries, specifically in iron and steel, who are taking a lot of actions in order to decarbonize, but then you would appreciate the fact that it is very difficult to decarbonize the process emissions in India for now, right? We're trying to innovate, but we understand that it might take us some time. Second part of this puzzle is the fact that the energy source, these industries require baseload power, which unfortunately comes from thermal. We are decarbonizing the power sector, but we need 24/7 electricity. We need storage. There are a lot of things that need to come together, and that's why I sort of reflected that there are a lot of policies that need to act together in order to decarbonize the industry, which goes beyond the industrial sector, right? It also sort of include the power sector. So maybe I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's the current state of place. Thank you.
Thank you, Subrata. So I've received the signal.
Simon, sorry, can I just come in on that? Because I think one of the things that we've been looking at in terms of CBAM is also, so within the UK, we are considering a CBAM, and obviously EU is attached. But one of the things that creates is some real tensions between actually we've got, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and actually how borders work. And actually this is where our businesses are certainly calling for to have a, to basically make it consistent across the whole of the EU, including the UK. And I think that is one of the things that needs to be looked at, and certainly there's certain discussions going on here, is how to make sure that we don't actually, we're competitive, and we actually enable low carbon products to come through, and we actually enable that kind of demand side as well, but also we make sure that we're not kind of disadvantaging other countries in terms of actually enable them to make that shift, because what we need it to actually incentivize the shift in every country, not just one country.
That's a great comment to end on. And since I've received the signal from the pavilion organizers that we should be wrapping up, we will wrap up. I'm just going to say that thank you to our panelists for what's been a really good discussion. And as we've been talking mostly about steel, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that these climate negotiations have been going on for about 30 years. They've made great progress in establishing the global norm that every country should have a net zero target. They all do now. But now the overwhelming focus surely has to be on practical collaboration to get the job done. And so I'm glad to be sitting here in the UK Pavilion, where there's a lot of effort going into the breakthrough agenda, a process to continually strengthen the international collaboration happening in each of the emitting sectors. And these conversations about will a CBAM be an effective instrument and should it work between Europe and India and so on, these are really the conversations that the governments ought to be having themselves. It shouldn't be confined to a side event. So thank you for joining us first thing in the morning. Please do finish off all the croissants in the corner there so that they don't get wasted. And after you've had a croissant, please feel free to stay for the next session in 15 minutes, which is also on industrial decarbonization. Thanks very much, everyone.